second session of the 7th India Forum on China. The session specifically focuses on techno-nationalism, technological rivalries in era of great power competition. Professor Alka Acharya, Honorary Director of Institute of Chinese Studies, Chairperson and Professor, Center for East Asian Studies, SIS JNU, will chair the session. The speakers for today's sessions are Dr. Tanvi Kulkarni and Mr. Manjunath Vasudev. Dr. Tanvi Kulkarni is a policy fellow at Asia Pacific Leadership Network for Nuclear Non-proliferation and Disarmament and a member of the APLN Secretariat. She will talk about China's nuclear buildup and its technological and geopolitical drivers, followed by Mr. Manjunath Vasudev, who is the founder member, managing director and CFO of Semtronics Microsystems Private Limited. He brings 10 years of technology industry experience to the Semtronics finance team. Now I hand over the floor to the chair to take the proceedings forward. Over to you, ma'am.
Good afternoon. We are running a bit behind schedule, so very brief kind of opening comment. Not so much really in terms of about the speakers, you've already got that, or about what they are about to say. Just a couple of things which occurred to me as the first session was going on. Clearly, Atul's talking about robotic labors in the field. This very morning I was just browsing the news, and I saw this, that officers in China now test ball-shaped robots as in policing. So in civil domestic issues, now they are planning to use these ball-shaped robots, and these will essentially they have been tested in quelling street violence. And as they are trying to address the street violence, the messages go to get human beings on the scene as soon as possible. So, well, partly what Venkat was saying, that they are actually innovating and first pushing these test balloons and trial balloons in the domestic and commercial kind of sector. But this is, of course, a new ball game entirely. And the other interesting news item that I read yesterday, which has implications for this larger objectives of this seminar, which is that why are top scientists leaving the West for China? And the drain is particularly remarkable insofar as the US is concerned. And we heard last year this very, very, very world-renowned mathematician, Yao Xing-tung, who has relocated from Harvard, and he is building up in Tsinghua, and he is building up this cell over there, bringing the best mathematicians from around the world and creating this unit here. So here we have, therefore, a very interesting trend. The introduction of high-tech, and in China, state-dominated, state-controlled, state-pushed, and this ability of China to provide this platform to its own scientists and technicians who, for a variety of reasons, are finding it convenient to shift and relocate. And I'm going to now put one question which had emerged, and this is now, we are in 2025 almost, but this had come up in 2019, shortly after the first term of Xi Jinping announcing this great push to develop high-tech, announcing that China saw capabilities in high-tech as the next frontier. Air Marshal Gokhale was talking about space as the final frontier, but I think science and technology is really the frontier which will determine supremacy in the final frontier. So I think this was an entire issue of Nature, very well-known, renowned magazine, which had this title. The whole issue was devoted to how China could dominate science, and this came out in 2019. and the subtitle was Should the World Worry? The compilation in this was a very interesting mix of both those who were worried and those who actually argued for science and tech being a domain which could not really just be in China's control, and that China was as open to becoming part of this new stage of technological evolution that the world was moving into. We've heard of about how different revolutions, industrial revolutions, scientific, technological revolutions, have changed the world. So really what we are trying to do is look at how China is moving into this field and whether China would be a different kind of a power in the way in which it harnesses science and technology. Would it actually transform the way in which West and East, North and South collaborate, compete in this very, very vital domain that will unfold in the 21st century? So I stop there and I invite Dr. Tanvi. You will be the first speaker to make her presentation. You have, thank you. You have 10 minutes, at the end of which you will be hear this, and then 2 minutes to sum up. Thank you. You want to come here, or you there? You want to come? Yeah.
Thank you so much, Professor Acharya. I want to start by thanking the 7th India Forum on China, the co-conveners, the Institute of Chinese Studies, Shivnadar University, and MITSOG for giving me the opportunity to speak at this forum. In terms of my own research, I look at China's nuclear weapons program, mainly from the prism of the nuclear politics of the Asia-Pacific region. So in that context, I'm going to speak on China's nuclear weapons buildup and its technological and geopolitical drivers. So ever since China tested its nuclear device in 1964, it has maintained an active nuclear weapons force in that it has actively and gradually over years expanded and modernized its nuclear systems, its missile systems, which it calls as its strategic forces. The Chinese have progressed from a 20 kiloton atomic bomb in 1964 to a hydrogen bomb in 1967 to a whole array of missile delivery systems, from your short-range missiles to medium-range, intermediate range, to long-range and even intercontinental range ballistic missiles. Of hundreds of thousands, of tens of thousands of kilometers of range. For instance, the DF-15 intercontinental ballistic missile is one of the most versatile missile that China has, and it has almost 3 variants, which is the DF-5A, B, and C. Currently, China has about 6 SSBMs, which is the nuclear-powered submarines in its arsenal. And these submarines deploy 2 kinds of submarine-launched ballistic missiles, the JL-2 and JL-3. So China has been modernizing and expanding its nuclear force to develop missiles across different platforms, like its land-based missiles, its sea-based missiles, its air-launched missiles, which is essentially called a triad when it comes to nuclear forces. It has also developed technologies like multiple independently targetable re-entry vehicles, MIRVs, which is essentially a technology in which you can fit a single missile with multiple nuclear warheads, and they go and they launch missiles in different trajectories. The DF-41, which is a large ICBM of the Chinese, which they showcased at the 2019 National Day Parade, has a range of about 12,000 kilometers and is capable of carrying about 10 nuclear warheads at the same time. So China is essentially building, all platforms, an integrated missile defense system. They have counter-missile defense systems, anti-satellite systems, land attack cruise missiles, and are also developing what is called as the hypersonic glide vehicles. This is essentially a technology in which a warhead is fitted on a ballistic missile. It glides and maneuvers at a hypersonic speed, essentially changing trajectories and evading a missile defense system. This trajectory of China's nuclear buildup is not really very unusual. Most nuclear weapon states aspire to build a nuclear force which has a secure second strike capability, which is the ability to take a nuclear weapon strike and then retaliate with your own nuclear weapons, and to build a survivable nuclear force. And the Chinese also want to build a nuclear force which is survivable and credible in terms of its nuclear deterrence. But what has been more concerning in terms of the Chinese nuclear expansion is the exponential pace at which the Chinese nuclear forces have grown over the last 10 years, and especially since 2019-2020. Until 2019-2020, the estimates for China's nuclear weapons stockpile was about 220 nuclear warheads in their stockpiles, which was more or less stagnant for many years. But then in 2024, the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists and the Federation of American Scientists, which are two agencies which study and assess and produce reports on the nuclear forces around the world, came up with a report saying that the Chinese nuclear warheads had increased to 440 in 2024, which means it had doubled only in 4 years. And this assessment goes on to say that if this trajectory continues, then by 2035, we could see a Chinese nuclear weapons arsenal of about 800 to 1,000 nuclear warheads, which is almost quadrupling or 4 times the number of warheads which they have currently. So this is enough to raise alarm bells across many other countries, and especially for China's strategic competitor like the United States. Now, this rapid expansion of its nuclear forces seems to also break away from a traditional Chinese nuclear policy of maintaining a small nuclear arsenal with a no first use policy. And in 1996, China had announced that it would stop its nuclear testing program. So what really explains this Chinese nuclear weapons buildup? A lot of the analysis that comes out from the Western and especially the English language literature, more so from the US defense and military thinking, seems to assess that China's nuclear expansion has a very definite military objective to it. They seem to assess that China is abandoning its traditional policy of maintaining a small arsenal and unilaterally developing offensive capabilities to use nuclear weapons, and especially threaten the use of nuclear weapons against adversaries in conflicts where their core national security interests are concerned, for instance, Taiwan. Some also assess that the Chinese are also trying to counter and challenge the US technological developments and advancements. But Chinese experts, and especially non-Chinese experts who have a close eye on China's military and defense programs, have a very different assessment of this. They believe that the Chinese modernization and expansion of its nuclear forces does not significantly indicate. Am I audible? Or even its behavior with regard to nuclear weapons. The Chinese nuclear expansion and modernization is certainly rooted in the intensifying geopolitical competition with the United States. But what China really wants to do is to get a geopolitical leverage against what it considers as or perceives as threats from the United States. So it's very difficult to get your hands on the operational doctrines of China, as is the case with countries like India. But from the declared nuclear policy that we understand from the defense white papers, and the last one was published by China in 2019, or from certain official statements from Chinese officials and leadership, one gets to see that the Chinese leadership has not really assigned a military objective to any of its nuclear weapon systems. A lot of Chinese nuclear developments are in line with its technological ambitions. So what China is doing in terms of modernization is improving accuracy, reliability, range, the predictability of its nuclear forces. And all these are in line of its technological ambitions, but also very much in line with the larger objective of what it wants to make PLA into a world-class military by 2049. What we really see of the Chinese nuclear force expansion is that it is quite in line with trying to maintain a secure second strike capability, trying to enhance survivability.
even the debates that you see in the Chinese strategic community are around how to enhance assured retaliation. And none of this is really about building a first strike capability against the United States. A first strike capability is essentially a capability in which you can strike first at your adversary and take out the adversary's nuclear forces. And it's very difficult to get to a first strike capability. And China has been really concerned about the US missile defense. China has been very concerned about the nuclear and non-nuclear capabilities that the US is developing, which it thinks can interfere, intercept, and counter its own missile systems. The Chinese leadership believes that the US is building a nuclear first strike capability. It is lowering the threshold of its nuclear weapons and using its nuclear strategy to threaten and coerce China, especially where its core interests are concerned, like Taiwan, South China Sea, or East China Sea. The growing US, Japan, Korea cooperation, especially in missile defense, the stationing of the US terminal high altitude air defense in South Korea in 2017, or the missile defense cooperation that the US is having with Australia or India, are all very concerning developments for China. Especially the collapse of the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty, the INF Treaty, if you've heard. The US withdrew from this treaty in 2019. This was a very serious concern for China, because what this treaty, abrogation of this treaty does, is it removes the limits on the range of nuclear weapons that the US can use and deploy from the Pacific, which are closer to the Chinese mainland. The Chinese are basically understanding all these developments as a way to weaken the Chinese nuclear deterrence, and so it feels the need to build a robust nuclear arsenal. And this, in Beijing's understanding, is rooted in the US's aim to maintain a global geopolitical dominance. If you see Chinese official and public opinion writings, they will all point to this, that the US refuses to accept China as an economic and geopolitical power. There is basically a deep mistrust of the US intentions, which prevents China from getting into any strategic dialogue with the United States. And this distrust is especially seen in President Xi Jinping's nuclear policy. President Xi, unlike his predecessors, looks at nuclear weapons as symbols of power. He looks at nuclear weapons as a significant geopolitical leverage against especially the United States. He looks at nuclear weapons as a means of influencing perceptions of other states to accept China's core national security interests and to respect China as a powerful state. Especially after 2019, following the pandemic, and a lot of criticism and anti-China campaigns were launched, we see that President Xi almost called for the expansion of Chinese nuclear arsenal with a vengeance. He approved expanding the missile inventory, more silos to be built. He raised the PLA rocket force as an independent arm of, a separate arm of the PLA. The rocket force is basically the force which maintains the land-based nuclear missiles. He has expanded space-related activities, cyber-related activities, so a whole range of activities. This really shows distrust in the US, which also comes from the Chinese understanding that the US has hegemonic arrogance and has illegitimate US interference in China's core national security interests. So what I do is I only conclude with a very significant incident that has happened very recently. In September this year, the Chinese PLA rocket force tested an ICBM, which went deep into the Pacific Ocean, about 11,800 kilometers. And this was most likely a nuclear-capable missile. The timing and the intention of this test has been very interesting. For the first time since 1980s, the Chinese have tested such kind of a missile into the Pacific Ocean. All other tests have been within its territory. Interestingly, this shows a changing pattern in how the rocket force is testing its nuclear-capable missiles, but also shows how the Pacific is now increasingly a ground for geopolitical contestation between the two countries. This test came almost 4 days after the quadrilateral security dialogue, the Quad dialogue. It came right after the US and Chinese military leaderships had met. So there was a strong signaling against the US. But it also shows that there is a domestic signaling that the Chinese are trying to do in terms of their nuclear modernization program. We've seen over the past 2 years that a lot of reshuffling has happened in the PLA rocket force leadership. 2 commanders have been dismissed over the last 2 years. The PLA-RM has come under heavy investigation for several irregularities. So this test was also a signaling to its own domestic constituencies to keep faith in the PLA rocket force leadership and the nuclear command and control. Just to conclude, are we going to see a further expansion of Chinese nuclear forces? Yes, we are. But it's important to understand where this expansion is coming from. It's coming from a sense of vulnerability of the Chinese to the US developments, and it's also coming from their own technological ambitions. Thank you.
Thank you, Kulkarni. I think you have, towards the conclusion, really brought out the chief kind of contention that characterizes this particular debate. Start with mistrust. That fuels its own cycle of suspicions and then counter-suspicions, and so it goes on. So I guess scholars like you are needed to place the issue on the table in terms of where is it coming from? What are the issues that are entering the debate as a consequence of this discussion? So how do we actually come to a clearer understanding of these concepts? So I think that was very lovely. Now, the only thing I'd like to comment is that maybe Xi Jinping is not as unusual in terms of his posture. Mao famously said that the nuclear weapon is paper tiger, but you needed it, as a show of trust. So the politics behind the understanding of nuclear war is still very much alive. I'll now request Manjunath Vasudev to bring his presentation.
Good afternoon, everyone. Good afternoon.
China's semiconductor ambition and implications.
Thank you, ICS, and thank you, Nehru, for inviting me to this debate. So, the topic is China's semiconductor ambition and implications for India. At the onset, let me talk about the applications of semiconductors. So today it is like it's ubiquitous. You can really see that in all these sectors. In fact, when you talk about agriculture, cell phones, defense systems, medical imaging, IoTs, and in automotive industry, you talk about automatic driver assistance systems. So it's everywhere. When you talk about sensors, you talk about the preamplifiers which are used for those sensors, and the processors which are used for those systems. Semiconductors is everywhere that you have in almost all walks of your life in practice. Just that's why when you go 30 years back, like where everything was manual or like mechanical systems. Like today you have everything electronics. That's where it is. Well, let's just look at the history of semiconductors. That in 1906, when the first IO was invented, where you have vacuum tubes being used for systems to when the first transistor was developed by William Shockley, John Barry, and Jawaharlal in 1947. And again in 1955 to 60, the first MOSFET was developed. And now what you have in the planar technology, the MOSFETs which are developed in that time, to what we have in FinFETs that we talk about today when we talk about 2 nanometer technologies and the lower submicron technologies. And going further, you have gate all around technology which is coming up to be like just to curtail the amount of leakage currents that you are having in the current MOSFETs. And also the body effect that you see in the current MOSFETs, where you can actually bring in more amount of precision to the amount of current that you are trying to handle over there, and also the lower voltages. And the next invention by Samsung, which is NDC, multi-channel FET, in fact, so multi-channel FETs. And this is semiconductor value chain. So let's just look at like what it involves in developing a semiconductor. So you have the wafers which come up, which is part of the materials, ingot which is used for preparing the semiconductor, and then you have the equipments which come up, which manufacture the semiconductors, and then you have your IPs, intellectual properties, which are used for manufacturing, and also the EDAs, electronic design automation tools, which are, let's say, for example, cadence, synopsis. These are some of the tools that are being used today. And design. When it comes to design, like, of course, like India being one of the hub for design, I can tell you that like nearly 50% of the world's design is happening in India. And wafer forms, Taiwan being one of the pioneers there, like manufacturing is happening there. Most of it, like literally 70% of the manufacturing happening in Taiwan. So that's the difference. And also packaging. Majority of it is happening in Southeast Asian countries where packaging is happening, and India is foraying into that given the kind of chiplet technology that is coming that we are using those fabric. Then comes that you are using these ICs into your programs, development of systems, where you use these chips and semiconductors to develop systems. And you give it to an EMS company that this IC is mounted on the boards, and you know, the way you see that you assemble as part of that product, be it a cell phone or a toy. That's the end product. So it so now like let's look at where China is. So China is the largest consumer of production of semiconductors. And the irony is like more than 80% of it is still being imported. Like India catching up with others. Even US, what US is having that market. So let us just look at the sequence of events like when it comes to semiconductor growth in China. So just coming to that conflict. So 1956 is when China produced its first tanks. That's where it started. Started early 1956, and in 1965 it created its first two tanks. Then going down, China prioritizes to set up engineering programs in semiconductor design in 5 major universities. This is, I'm talking about somewhere around 1956 to 65 time frame. And by mid 70s, they were able to have research conducted in their state labs, where manufacturing would happen in their state-funded factories. And by 1972, they were producing the first, third-generation computers over there. And their economic reforms, which happened in 1978, they imported around 24 second-hand semiconductor lines to manufacture some of these ICs. This I'm talking about somewhere in 1978, in fact. Around 1990s. I'm not going into whether they succeeded in it or whether they failed in it. I'm just looking into the attempts that they were making at each and every point. And around 1990, to accelerate the technological advancements, they started partnering with foreign firms, in fact, to see where they could see that like they can progress in technological advancements. And around 1995, they had a JV with Lucent Technologies to develop housing into an IDM, in fact, to say one of the major IDMs for that. When I talk about an IDM, it is integrated device manufacturer. Just to give an example, Texas Instruments is an IDM, which designs its own IC, manufactures its own IC, and sells it into the market. Around 96 to 2000, it aims to produce internationally competitive chips using Chinese intellectual property, where it's in-house developed Chinese IPs are used for developing its ICs. And 2014, they set up a China Integrated Circuit Industry Fund and additionally China Government Guidance Fund to invest into semiconductor companies. That's when the Made in China policy came up. And as you know, from 2018 to 2022, there were US restrictions on semiconductor companies, especially for new developments and all. And December 2023, China prohibits use of CPUs which use processors from US companies. And September 2024, China announces significant advancements in domestic DUV machines. So one of the speakers were talking about, in fact, it's a DUV and EUV earlier, in fact, so which are used in lithography. So when we talk about lithography, it is like about defining the geometries of the IC. When we talk about geometries, it's basically the gate of the MOSFET, which we are defining. As we try to make it much smaller and smaller, it will have many issues cropping up when it comes to specifically looking at the exact aspects of the device. So when EUV is not available and they have to use only DUV technology, which is used up to 22 nanometers currently outside, and EUV is used for submicron technologies. What you will have to do is like multi-pattern it, and also you will have to do a lot of research on the materials which are used for etching and all. So it's a long drawn process which it involves. In fact, to say a little, it's a costly process also, but given the kind of sanctions they have on their companies, they are restrained to go ahead with such kind of stuff. The yield would be less initially, but they would be refining it. And the latest news is like they are able to do this at 5 nanometer technology. So which US and all these guys were able to do it at, they use EUV for 5 nanometers, and lower technologies, they are able to use that with DUV, in fact, to say, and developed. And SMIC has come up with that, in fact. This is what it actually caught my sight, in fact, so when I actually read the policy. I have just taken a snapshot of that and I have put it over here. Probably I will just generate that, However, China is still in the process of industrialization and there is still a major gap compared with advanced countries. The manufacturing industry is large but not strong. The capacity for independent innovation is weak, and key and core technologies and high-end equipment are highly dependent on foreign countries. The manufacturing innovation system with enterprises as the mainstay is not perfect. Product quality is not high, and there is a lack of world-renowned brands. The efficiency of resource and energy utilization is low, and the problem of environmental pollution is more pronounced. The industrial structure is unreasonable, and the development of high-end equipment manufacturing and producer service lags behind other countries. The level of information is not high, and the depth of integration with industrialization is insufficient. The degree of industrial internationalization is not high, and the globalization of enterprises is inadequate to promote the construction of a manufacturing powerhouse. We must focus on solving the above problems. Oh, here it's a clear problem statement, clearly defined. Yeah, right? So I'll just give you whatever is the other one. To build a manufacturing powerhouse, we must firmly seize the rare strategic opportunity, actively respond to challenges, strengthen overall planning, highlight innovation drivers, formulate special policies, give full play to institutional advantages, mobilize the whole of the society to work hard, rely more on Chinese equipment and depend on Chinese brands, from made in China to created in China. This is an important statement. And the transformation of Chinese speed to Chinese quality, the transformation of Chinese products to Chinese brands, and the complete strategic task of growing Chinese manufacturing from big to strong. A very important statement, given that they have been a manufacturing house all these days, they want to build brands internally over here. You're talking about Apple, you're talking about Microsoft, you're talking about Tesla, and all these are product companies based out of US, in fact, to say. But when you look at these, they want to build their own products, which can compete with the world, in fact, to say. Let me just quickly move to the other point. Yeah, this is on the China semiconductor growth story. If you look at the number of semiconductor design firms in China from 2010 to 2002, you can see a drastic increase, in fact. So I have picked these data from IITF. I can tell you there are literally more than 3,000 odd companies. In India, you can just count them in fingers, the number of product companies which are there over here. And now, when you look at the global semiconductor industry and the product companies which are based out of US, which are literally there, like you can see them on the top, and China is somewhere at the bottom, in fact, to see, which are stationed, headquartered in US. Going to the manufacturing segment, back-end growth. This is, I'm talking about the fab and the ATMP facilities that you can look at. China is somewhere at the top notch, like where you can see them almost like 120 fabs, which are in, which are IDMs, in fact, to say. Number of ATMP facilities which are there, number of fabs which are coming up now recently between 2022 to 2025, and the Chinese equipments being used. The number of Chinese equipments that are there in the Chinese industry are just less than 15%. They are trying to see that like where they can occupy majority of that space. Research and development. You may be thinking where India is, like you will see only in this graph over here. So when it comes to research and development, of course, they are still leaders in that after United States and US. India is somewhere the fourth, in fact, to say. And when you look at the R&D expenditure also, of course, China is lagging behind on that, on the amount of R&D expenditure that they are doing. But like when you look at the number of patent applications, they are at the top now, currently. State subsidies. You would be wondering like how come these people are able to, manufacture so much at lower cost and all those things. It's basically funded by state subsidies. In fact, if you look at SMIC, Tsinghua Group, and they are majorly, and TSMC is nowhere near to it, and also Intel and Samsung. The amount of state subsidies that they are receiving from the government. Thank you. But like, let me closing note on the conclusion, right? I would just take 30 seconds. I was just brief you about my own experience when it comes to the implications. So me being from the semiconductor industry, having my own company, which is a fabless semiconductor IC company, which is into power management ICs, way back in 2015 and 16, when the central government came up with this Ujala scheme, replacing all these incandescent and as well as the CFL tubes and all those things with LED lamps. Central government came up with a tender, and EESL was the body which was awarded with it and which was supposed to replace all these things. Like, it was a huge volume. And most of the OEMs in India were looking at like where they could actually reduce the cost and bring it at a cheaper price where they can win the bids over there. So that's when some of the fabs based out of China, who were IGBT fabs, entered the scene, and they actually picked some IPs from Taiwan for the control sections, some MOSFETs, stitched it onto a normal PCB and pushed it into the Indian market at 3 cents. We were standing somewhere at 8 cents per IC. That was my cost price. Their sale price was 3 cents. So when India came up with this program, they didn't look into the implications of what it would mean for the MSME sector over here. Literally many more than, if I have to tell you, most of the MSMEs shut down at that point of time. And I had to shut down one of my testing units at that point of time. We were not able to deal with it. Within a span of 3 months, the BOM price of an LED bulb, just fell from 600 rupees to 40 rupees. Most of the bill of materials and whatever you had became redundant within a period of 3 months. That's an implication of what you can actually see. Right? Yeah. Thank you.
Say, because the implications, the entire analysis and the data that he has shown is making its own statement. Just makes me wonder, what is the kind of strategizing, what is the kind of framework in which we are planning to deal with these kind of new challenges? And it appears from what you are saying, in the example of the CFL, not much thinking went other than ho jaye.
Yes. And if I have to tell you one thing, I just appreciate the Chinese in this segment, especially when it comes to their clarity of mind. The reason, very reason why I put a snapshot over there was like, once you know the problem, you can solve that. Identifying the problem is another task. They have done it.
Well, the floor is open. We've got about, I think, 10 to 15 minutes to raise comments, questions, suggestions, observations, anything. Two very interesting papers. So I see Atul already here. Atul, go ahead.
What is China's stand on NFU? Like, we have been hearing that there are so many restrictions on that, but are they still sticking with it? Or have they have? No questions.
We'll take 2 or 3 questions and then have them addressed. Yes, please. Aida. Huh? Oh, you have to, he has to repeat it. Okay, please repeat it and speak on the top of the mic because that's where the amplification occurs.
Thank you. What is China's stand on NFU? I mean, there has been so many speculations that they are in the process of chunking it, and there are also too many conditions imposed on the NFU process. Now, out of 9 nuclear powers, only 2 are adhering to this policy, we and Chinese. So how they look at it? Can you please explain?
Could you just identify yourself? It would be nice to know.
Thank you. What role can cultural exchange play in improving India-China relations? And how is India navigating its economic ties with China while managing strategic concerns?
So you would, whom do you wish to? Anybody can address, okay. Right, thank you. Could you identify yourself?
Okay.
MIT
School of Government student in this batch, 20th batch. Thank you.
Shan, thank you very much.
So, good afternoon, ma'am. This is Nirja Anil Krishna from MIT School of Government. My question is specially for Dr. Tanvi Kulkarni, ma'am. Ma'am, you spoke about China's nuclear modernization. So, I want to know what can be its implications on number 1, India's nuclear doctrine, especially as far as the non-proliferation treaty is concerned. And second thing, how will it affect India's aspiration of getting a permanent seat in the UN Security Council? Thank you.
Hello, my name is Acharya. I am also from MIT SOG. My specific question is about technology and application. One side it is technology, but for application to develop we need purpose. So can we say that China has found its purpose for the technological and on the basis of application development? And what are its implications in the global world? Because they are more on the side of building disruptive applications. What's your take on it? Thank you.
Okay. I think we'll take those 3 questions. So can we go first?
So, thank you. I'll take the question on NFU and perhaps the question that was directed directly at me on implications for India's nuclear doctrine for the NPT and for the UNSC permanent seat. And I'll probably defer the question for technology to my co-panelist. As far as we know from the Chinese declared policy, it still has its no first use policy. The last Chinese defense white paper was in 2019. After that, there has been no defense white paper published, but that still consistently says NFU. Statements from Chinese officials thereafter have also sort of alluded that the NFU policy still exists on paper. The no first use policy of nuclear weapons is always a conditioning policy. That's the case with India as well. India also has a conditional NFU Um, and so is the case with China. Um, as far as on-ground developments take place, for instance, the moment you have developed your sea-based deterrent fleet, there are questions on the NFU. So, as is the case with India as well, that, what happens when you develop your nuclear submarines and your SLBNs? What happens to your NFU policy? But, I mean, to be honest, in terms of NFU, it's really a matter of what goes by the word. So India and China both profess an NFU, and I think in terms of just the nuclear threat perception, we are quite content that neither will use nuclear weapons first against each other. What are the implications for China's nuclear modernization on India's nuclear doctrine? I don't see any significant implications. And I don't think that there should be any significant implications for China. Like I said, a lot of the Chinese nuclear modernization expansion comes from how it perceives threats from the US. The Chinese are also closely watching what's going on in terms of the Russian nuclear behavior in Eastern Europe, in Ukraine, and how NATO is reacting to it. There is always a trickle-down effect. For instance, India's nuclear weapons planning has a lot to do with what can China threaten. So yes, there will be an impact in how we think about the China threat. But as far as our nuclear doctrine is concerned, we are very sure that it's about assured retaliation. It doesn't matter whether China has 300 warheads or 800 warheads. Ultimately, one warhead is enough, right? What we need is the capability to absorb that strike and retaliate. So just as China, India also maintains that it wants a secure second strike capability, it wants a survivable force. Our nuclear trajectory definitely is also being modernized and expanded, but I don't see any significant change in India's nuclear doctrine per se. On the NPT, India is not a member of the NPT. China is a signatory to the NPT as a nuclear weapons state. The NPT definitely is in trouble. There's a lot of contestation between how the Russians and the Chinese think and how the West thinks. But again, China has had its history of nuclear proliferation in the past, but currently it doesn't really affect what's going on at the NPT and the politics there. The UNSC permanent seat, the permanent members of the UNSC are definitely the 5 nuclear weapons powers, but over the years there has been a lot of contest about whether countries like France or even the UK should remain permanent, and there should be an expansion of the UNSC to include more economic and other technological powers. I don't see this to have really any context with the current modernization of nuclear forces around the world.
Thank you, Tanvi. Coming to your question about identifying the purpose where the applications would get into for ICs, and right. Specifically speaking, when in comparison with China, India has been a design house, and when it comes to deriving the specifications of a product, we are still lagging behind. If I have to tell you, the US has always been doing that, identifying the product specifications, deriving the product specifications, and just give it to the design teams over here who would actually design ICs or systems based on that. Where most of our engineers have also failed in trying to identify or understanding the psyche of the customer, what this customer would be looking for a specific purpose. Let me talk about even agriculture, where it is where you would be looking at how you can understand the problem and derive the specifications from the problem. That's something that I see that is associated with the psyche of the design engineers who are in India. In fact, to say sitting in cozy air-conditioned rooms, that doesn't help. You need to get onto the ground and talk to customers or talk to people. One of the best things that have happened, sitting in Pune, I can tell you, the automotive industry, especially when it comes to defining the products and branding it, they have just led the way. In fact, so that's the way to go. I would the way the automotive industry has actually progressed. Yeah, thanks.
Any more questions? Yes, one and then Japan. Yes, go ahead.
Hello. Good afternoon, ma'am. Myself, Soham Deshmukh. So my question is directed to you. Firstly, there is talk about China gathering a nuclear fleet or nuclear submarine for their Arctic Silk Route that aims at trade with Russia, better trade with Russia. So how do you look at it? And secondly, uh, you mentioned that China is continuously increasing its nuclear fleet and nuclear warheads. So how does this bode well with the entire dissect mandate and disarmament that comes into picture? So those are the two questions that I had for you.
Yeah, thank you. Tanvi, to sort of continue with the India angle, one of the things that you pointed out that the Chinese were doing, and you were very clear that it was not about a first strike capability, but they were simply improving their accuracy of their delivery systems, etc. So, uh, what is your assessment of the state of India's own deterrence capabilities? I mean, it's a big, broad question, but I mean, our biggest challenge is obviously China. So, what is the state of affairs there, perhaps? To Manjunath, uh, I mean, the CFL example you gave, and you just mentioned the automobile sector, and that the automobile sector has taken a lead. But the automobile sector is not one that is really dependent on subsidies as a policy, in India. It has managed to sort of go forward despite the lack of government intervention, right? So, how is it that certain sectors, I mean, this is a sort of a broad question again, but from a policy point of view, it's interesting to figure out why is it that certain sectors are able to move forward despite lack of government support. Um and I suppose related to that is what is your assessment of this production linked incentive scheme uh, for semiconductors and now a whole bunch of maybe 10 sectors? I mean, it's, as a member of this Bharat Semiconductor Society, what is your sense of the government's receptivity to, as you mentioned, uh, problems from the field, problems out of the semiconductor, I mean, the air conditioned rooms, as you mentioned? Thank you.
Yes, there's one at the end. Oh, you again, and then one here. So you already asked one. We'll come to you after this one. Yes.
My question is to Manjunath sir. Sir, as you mentioned, China is very far in semiconductor industry, and it has been said that India's almost three-fourth of the semiconductor raw materials or things are imported from other countries. So, do you think India will be able to bridge the gap, that is the vast gap that exists in the semiconductor industry between China and the other nations? And do you think the courses like VLSI, which is being brought up in a small scale setup like diploma or PG diploma, will you be, do you think that will it able to improve the technical skills in the students to get into the industry or something? Yes.
I think that will be the last question, and we'll then ask our panelists to respond.
Sir, being from the field of politics, I wanted to ask a specific question is that semiconductor industry is still in a nascent stage. So what policy changes do you think are required from the side of the government?
Okay, thank you. Any questions from the women students here to restore some gender balance, or? Okay, probably they're like me, just digesting, processing the information. So thank you very much. Very good set of questions. Tanvi, you go first. And then
Okay. So the question on the Chinese Arctic Silk Route and its submarine capabilities there. To be very honest, I'm not very privy to understanding what this really means. Someone like Dr. Jacob, who looks at Chinese military developments more closely, might be able to confirm. But as far as I understand, the Chinese are definitely looking at a naval and maritime expansion of their capabilities. This is a part of it. You will also hear of Chinese submarines making deep ways into the Indian Ocean, into the Pacific Ocean. Submarines are exactly those kind of capabilities which go long distances without being detected. I'm afraid I don't really have much beyond this to speak about this. What does this mean for arms control and disarmament? The disarmament discourse, especially the nuclear disarmament discourse at the moment, is a completely stagnant one. What we are seeing over the last 10 years is every nuclear weapons country expanding their nuclear programs in terms of quality, in terms of quantity. Really, the talk about disarmament has gone on the back burner. Over the last few years, we've seen that the Cold War arms control treaties have broken down. The US has withdrawn from treaties. The Russians have withdrawn from treaties, which were really the foundation of talking about reducing nuclear weapons. So unfortunately, we are not in a place where we talk about disarmament, arms control. I think what I was trying to say through my presentation was that if we want to bring back talk about reducing nuclear weapons, especially when it concerns the US and the Chinese, what a lot of close China watchers are saying is that the US needs to understand that the Chinese are not really competing tit for tat for their nuclear weapons. What the Chinese are really competing for is the demand to be looked at as equal powers, to demand respect from the US as a significant global player. And its nuclear weapon systems are just a way of showing that, rather than saying we want to take out X targets of the US or any other place. To Jabin's question on India's deterrence capability, I mean, to start with, we are not on the same technological level as these big powers like the Russians, the US, or the Chinese. For the last several decades, the Indian effort has been to develop the ICBM capability, the Intercontinental Ballistic Missile Range capability, to build a credible deterrent against China. What we're doing is catching up to technologies like MERV, which we've done by testing the Agni 5 recently. So there is definitely a technological progression taking place, but really not at the level of where the Chinese and the Americans are playing in terms of mixing your conventional and nuclear technologies, or building thinking of building space-based deterrence systems. And that's more or less, I think, the Indian strategic thinkers are okay with this, because we are developing according to our threat assessments. We're not really developing our deterrent technology to play a nuclear arms race with any of these countries. And of course, for India, the constant irritant is Pakistan. So on one hand, while countries like China can still not develop their SRBM, their short-range missiles with nuclear capabilities, we still have to concentrate on our short-range nuclear missiles, for instance, because the Pakistan irritant is always there. I think I'll just stop at that.
Thank you. Coming to the question on other industries, how are they able to fare well, despite they not being not receiving some of the subsidies and all? Putting it across, like if I have to tell you, like automotive sector was one, and software obviously received the late 90s and all, like income tax rebates and all. There was some government support at that point of time. Automotive at least like grew in the later part of 2000s, in fact, to say, in India, with some government support, not as much as what you are seeing in semiconductor today. We were made to believe, I mean to say, like around 2005 or supposedly during Atal Bihari Vajpayee's time, like there was a talk about setting up Fab City and all in Hyderabad, but that was just shut, in fact, to say, abruptly once Manmohan Singh's government came. Like the government's decision, it was government's decisions, and it was not part of their agenda, in fact, to say. thanks to the current government, like they are again looking into it. And as you know, semiconductors is capital intensive, right from the design phase to, it encompasses many industries. It's just not that like uh, you can manufacture, and I see like it involves many engineering streams, right, from chemical engineering to mechanical, including civil. So it encompasses a gamut of engineering disciplines, and when it comes to that, and developing the resources required for that. We have lacked in that, in fact, if I have to tell you, during the initial phases, where we have focused more on the design aspect of it. Like that was obviously led by the US putting in the requirements over here. Like one of the first companies to come to India was Texas Instruments. After that, like many companies followed. Like so the more focus was on the design aspect of it, even though even that was capital intensive, given the resource cost and as well as the EDA cost is quite high over there. And yeah, obviously now when you look at the kind of policies that have been put into place, like the PLI scheme and the DLI scheme and all, that's a good initiative where government is trying to fund to see to it that like it's on par with its peers outside, like, other countries, in fact, to say. And how effective is it? Yeah, that would require a lot amount of, testing the waters, like getting the feedback from the market and doing it. It's not going to be straightforward. There are no tested rules that like this is going to work over there. So people have to spend time and money on those things to do that. And PLI is a very good scheme, in fact, to say, if I have to tell you, when it comes to production. Of course, when it at this point of time, we have only the packaging lines which are coming up over here. Yeah. And coming to the question of semiconductor courses, like upskilling people over here. One of the growth of Indian semiconductor industry has been that the college output that you get currently are not employable. Whatever the courses that are being offered today, of course, I understand the hype about AI, ML and all, but I still insist that students have to focus on their basic physics, in fact, to say whatever is, the basic engineering stream subjects. That's very crucial. You may talk about AI, you may talk about ML, everything, but like your core basic subjects are pertinent. If you have to scale up you have a hold on your subjects, that's what it is. And whatever the engineering streams that are there, like the basic engineering streams and the output from those, it's very important that like you get a good hold on your core subjects. And coming to the policy inputs, what we can actually give to the government, right? Currently, whatever schemes that the government has actually come up, especially the DLI scheme, PLI scheme, design linked incentive scheme, of course, like they have identified quite a few core ICs which needs to be developed, keeping in I understand the government's concern looking at the imports that are happening into the country, and they are trying to have an import substitution over here by developing it locally over here. The basic crux over there is trying to define the problem statement and then deriving the specifications of the product that they need to develop. That's where I suppose they are faltering at this point of time. There are nearly around, in Bangalore at least, like which majority of the DLI awardees have been from Bangalore. So that is what I see when I actually interact with them as part of BSS, when I interact with these people. Where deriving the spec itself, like they are faltering, in fact, to say. Yeah.
Thank you. The questions indicate the excellence of the two presenters in generating questions, ideas, and providing a lot of information out here on two very critical themes. And so my thankfulness to both the presenters. I think, Sean, your question about culture, I just conclude by not directly addressing what you really raised, but asking myself whether culture is a factor in understanding how these two countries are going divergently towards roughly the same kind of goals. I've also read the Make in India set of papers and documents. I've not yet come across anything as self-critical, as self-reflexive as the Made in China 25 document was. That you actually put the magnifying glass on your weaknesses, your weak spots, your limitations, and see how to address them. It's all about doing this, doing that, reaching here, reaching there, but how and why is missing. So is this a cultural factor, that this ability to be self-critical, to be able to switch your policies when you find that they are not really reaching the same goals, ability to be flexible in your different dimensions of decision making. Are these factors which are because of culture? So what we had the last session conclusion that, as Atul said, do we actually think about these things, and are we going to learn anything from what's happening around us? Because this is really going to be one of the most critical arenas which will show how we evolve as a 21st century power. So thank you both very much for some very interesting reflections and ideas, and thank you all for the great set of questions, and on to lunch, I guess. Thank you.
Professor